you have invited me to speak on probably the most depressing day that, at least in political terms, I have ever experienced. For the United Kingdom to be leaving the European Union fundamentally undermines almost everything I've worked for in my journalistic life. In 1973, when we voted to come in, I'd just begun as a journalist, and I went out to the European Parliament, where my father was one of the very first members, British members of the European Parliament, and the British were greeted with such enthusiasm. They called it La Grande Rentrée, the great return of the British to Europe. And suddenly we come full circle, and the British are leaving with their tails between their legs. And it's a crazy decision. It's a crazy decision that has divided this country more than any other decision that I can remember in my life. It's an extraordinary act of national self-harm. It's a retreat into the past, a return to the world. As a child, we were brought up with a wonderful illustrated history book. It was called Our Island Story, and it was all the heroes of fundamentally English history. King Alfred the Great, Henry V, mentioned by John earlier, and wonderful colourful illustrations. But it was all the triumph of the little island over adversity. And I fear that we're retreating back to our little island, having only just realised what it was like to be in the big wide world. Now, that's not entirely true, of course. There was a global Britain for several centuries, but I just feel very sad that we had, I think, finally found an answer to the question, if you remember, that was put by the American Secretary of State, Dean Acheson, when he said, the trouble with Britain is they've lost an empire, but they haven't found a role. And now we found a role in Europe as an engaged and substantial participant, and we're walking away from it. It's not so much economically damaging as I fear it's psychologically damaging. It is a retreat from a world which I passionately believe needs to be more engaged and more cooperative and more multilateral, and in fact we are turning our backs on it. The truth is, look at that division within the country, and forgive me if I talk a little bit about Brexit, because I know that at the beginning of the week you all said, I'm not sure if it really matters to us. And I want to prove to you today that it does, because it tells us something that we need to be fighting against in many places. The young in this country, your generation, voted overwhelmingly to remain in the European Union. It was my age group, the old pensioners, who voted to leave. The university educated, probably the one statistic that tells you more, a more exact match of the vote, was that the university educated voted to remain, but non-university educated voted to leave. It was those in the prosperous and successful parts of the country, like Oxford, where we're sitting today, like London, like Cambridge, but also like Bristol and Manchester and Leeds and Newcastle. They all voted to remain. And it was the rather, well, as John said at the beginning of the week, it was the left behind, those with the old dying industries, Stoke-on-Trent and the potteries, the textile towns of South Yorkshire, that voted to leave. And I fear they will suffer more from this than anybody else. So it was a vote by the unsuccessful part of the country that won against the successful part of the country. The other thing about it was, vitally, that the small nations of the United Kingdom, Scotland and Northern Ireland, voted to remain in Europe, and it was the English, with a little bit of help from the Welsh, who now seem to be regretting it, who voted to leave. And that's going to put the United Kingdom under huge pressure after Brexit. I don't know whether Scotland will vote for independence or not, but it's back on the table. I don't know whether Northern Ireland will vote for reunification in Ireland, but it's back on the agenda. These things are now back on the agenda where they'd actually moved on and we'd moved off. So it's a huge pressure on the unity of the country itself. And the Brexit campaign was all about emotion. And one of my quotes, if you like, which I've used before in this engagement, in this event, is those famous lines from W.B. Yeats, the Irish poet, when he was very worried about where the process of Irish nationalism was taking Ireland to independence. And he said, "The best lack all conviction, and the worst are filled with passionate intensity." And one of the messages I want to get across to you today is, if we're going to be sane in this crazy world, we must believe with passion in what we believe in, and not allow, if you like, the others, the nationalist side, to actually have all the emotion and all the best arguments. The Brexit side in the debate had a brilliant slogan: "Take back control." And it was a slogan that played to people's fears about being out of control. And I want to talk a little bit about that, because I think that's what makes us, in this crazy world, that we are feeling many of the things that came up in the session you've just had with Roderick about the challenges ahead, are things that are deeply unsettling, deeply destabilizing. The other reason why I call it a crazy world we're living in relates to the way I've been describing how we feel here, those of us who didn't want to leave the European Union. Now it's happening, because it's going to happen at 11 o'clock tonight. And I've said, well, it's a bit like living in an open-air lunatic asylum, where we've put the chief lunatic, called Boris Johnson, in charge. And the funny thing is, I say that to friends of mine from America, or from Germany, or from Russia, and they say, oh, come on, don't think you've got it all alone. It's just as bad in Washington, or in Berlin, or in Moscow. We're all living in something of an open-air lunatic asylum. So, why? Why are we in this position where we're feeling, where we've put in charge? In Boris Johnson, you heard a little bit about Boris. I know him very well and all his family. And he's an utterly disreputable journalist. As most of you are journalists, and I am too, I would say this: never allow journalists to go into politics. Because all they're after is tomorrow's headlines. All they're after is the next day. And Boris is brilliant at it. He's always just thinking, where's the big headline tomorrow? The other extraordinary capacity he has is to actually then completely change his mind and get away with it. But I'll come back to that. We voted for Boris Johnson, and the United States voted for Donald Trump. Why, when they're feeling insecure, do they put such chances into power? Now, as we heard on Monday, not just, I think, both from Edward Lucas and on Tuesday from Arkady Ostrovsky, the end of the Cold War was not the end of history, as Francis Fukuyama so impetuously declared, because the end of the Cold War, it came and it compounded it came on top of and compounded a whole raft of other sources of insecurity. Christopher Coker put first not 1989 but 1979, the opening of China, the beginning of the great geopolitical shift we've seen. But almost simultaneously, or on its footsteps, we had the advent of the internet and the explosion of mass ownership of computers, beginning a technological transformation which we're still struggling to come to terms with. You lot find it a hell of a lot easier than I do. After all, I learnt my journalism on a typewriter, and as Andre said, with shorthand in my notebook and no tape recorder. But that technological transformation really begins late 70s, early 80s. I got my first computer to write on, I think, in about 1984. The third thing, which came on top of the end of the Cold War, was actually nuclear proliferation, the one subject that you didn't single out in the previous session, and yet which I think is still hanging over us as a huge threat. Look at India and Pakistan, both nuclear-armed states confronting each other in Kashmir. Clearly, there's the whole climate change crisis, the ecological collapse that we face if we don't get it right, the bushfires in Australia that just don't seem to stop. And then we've got mass migration, another destabilizing factor coming from conflict, but also coming from the globalization process and the demographic challenge of the poor moving to richer places, the drift and the arrival of migrants from Africa wanting jobs, please. I'll come back to that because it's more complicated, but then ethnic and religious conflict, and then perhaps the most destabilizing in this part of the world and in the US, the financial crises. But it was also in Russia and Asia, 1998, the collapse of the ruble, and 2008, then the global financial crisis in the rest of the world. So all of that coming together, and growing inequality. Who suffered from the financial crisis? Not the rich guys, not the bankers. It was the rest of us who lost jobs and so on. So all of that are those sources of insecurity that I think have led people to say, put up the barriers, put up the borders, let's go back to the nation state. The nation state is a safe place to be. And that's what was behind, to me, the Brexit vote. And it's what behind Donald Trump talking of America first. And I think it's behind Vladimir Putin talking in terms of Russian nationalism, and Xi Jinping in China, and Bolsonaro in Brazil, and Narendra Modi in India. We have nationalism returning all round. Now, of course, there's a good side to what's been happening too, but the good side brings with it, I think, some of the problems. Take first, huge reduction in poverty in China. It's been a fantastic period for bringing poor people out of poverty. But exactly what we've seen is that as people get slightly more prosperous, whether it's in China or other parts of Asia or Africa or Latin America, they want to move. They're not happy to stay at home in a bit of a miserable old world. They want to move. So when we come up with an idea, and the Europeans are thinking of this all the time, we must invest in more development in poor countries of Africa. Actually, what that may very well mean is greater migration rather than less migration. Secondly, the dramatic improvement in health. In our health, we're getting older. And so, as Rod put his finger on it, there is an old age problem looming with fewer and fewer active workers to keep the old going to their 90s. I hate to say it, but I probably will live to my 90s. My mother and father both did, so I fear I'll follow in their footsteps. So that again has a downside. And finally, the technological transformation. I mean, I don't know if any of you watched at Davos, the talk given at Davos by Yuval Noah Harari, author of Homo sapiens and so on, when he focused on the real challenge of technological transformation and a world in which artificial intelligence is going to replace half the jobs we take for granted today and keep replacing them, and we won't be able to keep up. So technological transformation, which should produce the answers perhaps for climate change or other things, are also going to very much destabilize our world. So all of those improvements have also brought with them the destabilization that's causing us to fear for the future. Greater prosperity leads to more mobility, leads to more climate change. I've just spent abusing my carbon footprint 3 weeks in Southeast Asia. I was in Thailand, in Vietnam, in Malaysia, and in Singapore. And I was just gobsmacked by the scale of development that's going on in that part of the world, that the urban development and the high-rises and the transportation, the shopping malls, make Europe look miserable in comparison. Quite extraordinary what's happening. But that means that we're going to be consuming more energy all the time. And the trouble is that all of those things, and technological change above all, means we're losing control. What was the slogan of the Brexit campaign? Bring back control. The slogan of my side of the argument, the Remainers, was stronger together. It doesn't have the same ring to it, does it? Bring back control is what people wanted. And so the nationalism that we thought we had banished after 1945, with the creation of the multilateral system, and then with the creation of the European Union, all seems to be in retreat. The nationalism is back again. The other thing that is under threat by all of this, and there was I don't know if you saw, you've been so busy with your seminar, that 2 days ago there was a new report from an organisation at Cambridge called the Centre for the Future of Democracy, which said that the level of dissatisfaction with democracy is greater, it's at an all-time high right across developed countries, in the US, in the UK, in Brazil, in Mexico, in South Africa, Colombia and Australia, in countries too like Japan and Spain and Greece. There is now a majority of the population who feel that democracy doesn't produce the answers. And it's a transformation since the mid-1990s, a transformation from the world where Francis Fukuyama could say, it's a triumph of liberal democracy. Back in 2005, to take 15 years ago now, the level of dissatisfaction was in the 38%. Today, that level of dissatisfaction in those leading countries like the US and the UK is 57%. People are saying democracy isn't the answer any longer. Why? Because precisely it's proved unable, in their view, to deal with the shocks, the economic shocks, corruption scandals, and the migration flows, to name just those that people feel democracy isn't the answer. In the US, there's a real loss of trust in the democratic process. In the European Union, a feeling that there is a democratic deficit, that, oh, it's all fixed by bureaucrats in Brussels, which is rubbish. It's not. There is, in fact, a very real democratic system in Europe, but it's distant and people don't really believe in it. In the UK, I think there's two things very specifically. Earlier today, was it John mentioned the scandal over members of Parliament's expenses. It really hammered the democratic status of our members of Parliament to be seen to have basically fiddled their expenses. They were claiming things they shouldn't have done. That really undermined them. And then the Brexit process seems to have produced a situation of sort of democratic deadlock. Now, the problem is that I think we confuse our democracies, and that's one of the things that I want to get across as clearly as I can. What we've tried to do in this country, its democracy was always, and it was built on parliamentary democracy. Election of political parties, renewed every 5 years, fulfilling what was once beautifully said to me by a Russian politician. The thing about democracy, it's about learning how to lose. If you don't have democracy, there's no way of getting rid of the bastards. But with democracy, you do. And it was a parliamentary system. What we never had in this country was referendum democracy. And what we've had with this Brexit vote is a clash between the referendum democracy, black and white. Choose, remain or leave. That's it. And it's final. Or parliamentary democracy, which says, hang on, that's all too simplistic. Life is much more complicated. Let's work out compromise. Let's work out a way of dealing with the issue. And these two forms of democracy in this country were at loggerheads. They were in a complete stalemate. But it made people feel fed up with democracy because the media, and I will come to the media in a minute, said, but the referendum was the will of the people. Very dangerous words to use. I don't think there is such a thing as the will of the people. There's no single will of the people. It's words that keep being used, but it's actually... it's a distortion of democracy to say that there are absolutes like that. But in this country, that was perceived to be, we've had a referendum, it was the will of the people, Parliament must now roll over and do what it says. You may well know that in the German constitution, drawn up after 1945, national referendums are forbidden, because Germany decided that referendums had undermined democracy in the 1930s. They undermined the status of the German parliament, and so they don't allow them. We've allowed them to come in by the back door. We don't have a written constitution, so we have referendum democracy, and suddenly our democratic process is actually completely... the parliamentary process is completely undermined. Let me just now, what I want to do is to look at, in this situation of insecurity, in this crazy world, what's the media doing? What are we doing, the media, to help or to make it worse? Because I worry that actually the way we report, in many ways, does make the losing faith in democracy, the lack of trust in politicians, the fear of insecurity, the fear of the other, of immigration, of the outside world, all of those things, unless we get it right, unless we can explain to people how the system works, it actually makes the craziness worse. I mean, we are the fourth estate. We are a vital component of a democratic system, holding power to account. That's how, certainly, I would see the role of journalists in political reporting? Have we been holding power to account? Have we been challenging the rise of fake news when Donald Trump makes outrageous claims, or Boris Johnson? Boris Johnson has negotiated a deal on Brexit, which means that instead of having a border within the Irish Republic, there will be checks on goods going between Britain and Northern Ireland and back again. It's written down in black and white in the agreement he's done. Boris Johnson has told us now, not once, but about 10 times, that it's absolute rubbish, that agreement doesn't exist, and if anybody sends you a bit of paper where you have to fill out if you're a business person in Northern Ireland or selling to Northern Ireland, just put it in the waste paper basket. The outrageous idea that he can just deny the deal he's just done, and he gets away with it. But we are not doing enough to hold people to account when they basically invent a new truth, invent a new world. I think we've contributed to the loss of trust in the democratic process. It's partly not our fault. It's partly a result of that technological change, of the explosion of information on the internet. It's what I would call perhaps the blogification of the media, where in order to compete in this world of information overload, opinion becomes much easier to peddle than factual reporting. Everybody wants to be a columnist. Nobody really wants to be a reporter. I found this when at the Financial Times, and I was the foreign editor for a few years, and I was hiring journalists, and everybody who came through my door wanted to be a columnist. They didn't want to be a reporter. And I said, go away and learn to report the facts. Learn to find out what's happening. Don't immediately expect to be a columnist. But on the internet, everybody's a columnist. On the internet, everybody is much keener to put across opinions without actually necessarily checking the facts. I've been very fortunate in my life to have spent most of my life working for a very unusual sort of newspaper, a business paper. Now, the thing about working for a business paper is they don't want, your readers don't want you to be misleading them. They don't want lots of opinions. They want to know the facts, because they either want to make money or they don't want to lose money. And so it's a rather good discipline to work for. But I must admit that's not the norm for journalism as a whole. Generalist newspapers and broadcasters and writers in new media have got to compete for attention. They've got to also try and get more readers so they can make more money from advertising, from clicks on the internet or whatever. And far too often that means not reporting uncomfortable truths, but pandering to the prejudices of the readers or the viewers. For me, the best news story in the world is one that challenges my prejudices, my expectations, the ones that make me say, oh my God, it isn't how I thought it was, that it looks different when you talk to enough people, that the reality is different. Wow, that's not what I thought. And it makes one sit up, but it makes your readers sit up too. But it may be uncomfortable. And so much of news today is not about stories that challenge our prejudices. It's celebrity scandal, it's entertainment. And so coverage of politics too tends to go to encourage, to focus on the great entertainers, whether it's Boris Johnson or whether it's Donald Trump, or whether indeed somebody who realized at a very early stage the power of the media is Vladimir Putin and used it extremely successfully. Donald Trump is a master of reality television. Boris Johnson is the master of the funny soundbite, the memorable quip, the good joke. He is fantastic at working a crowd, working an audience and getting across. Bill Emmett, who was the editor of The Economist magazine a few years ago, he called it the advent, or what he called it was the Berlusconiization of politics. The advent of politicians who could make outrageous statements and then turn round and say the opposite and get away with it. Just laughing it off. A sort of, it's a good joke. Boris Johnson fits into that category. Nigel Farage, the man who probably, as much as anybody, drove the process towards the Brexit referendum, he also fits into that category. Outrageous statements and then just laugh it off. We, the journalists, have got to pin those down. The other problem with the media, and this is a very, a very specific thing to Britain. The British media has utterly failed for the last 30 years to explain and just to make intelligible the process that we were engaged in, the European process that we were engaged in, multilateralism, the external world. It was just dismissed as too complicated to explain. As I said earlier, Brussels isn't just a monstrous bureaucracy of full-time bureaucrats. The problem with Brussels is it is a complicated system of different institutions. So the bureaucrats sit in the European Commission, but the Council of Ministers, where the 28, now soon to be 27 countries of the European Union sit, are all elected governments, all negotiating. And then you have the European Parliament, all directly elected, who can also change the rules, change the system, and actually you've got to get the balance right. I loved, when I was a reporter back in Brussels in the 1980s, I loved going along to the European Parliament because I felt this is really important. This is the democratic core of this new European system. We must try and help people to understand how it works, and whether and nobody else bothered. You know, I went to the European Parliament on the day that if you may remember, the ill-fated European Constitution went to be voted on in the European Parliament, and there was only one other British journalist who'd cared to attend, and I think his ticket had been paid for by the European Parliament to come from Scotland. Nobody else could be bothered to go. And so there really is a problem for journalists if we're not focusing on helping people understand the political process that they should be engaged in. Now, the other thing, come back to for a moment the explosion of information on the internet, because that has really put pressure on the media, I think, in different ways that I fortunately have escaped. Deadlines are much tighter. Competition is much greater. It's raised the pressure to match other people's stories without checking them out. You haven't got time. You've just got to get out there and match it. And so while the internet is both a fantastic liberation, providing multiple news sources, it actually, and it's also much more difficult for an authoritarian government to control. It's clearly not impossible, but more difficult. But it means that we are faced so much with drawing on unchecked or uncheckable sources of information. And the pressure on journalists now, I mean, in the old days, writing for a newspaper, you got up in the morning, said what's on the agenda today, and you had till about 5 o'clock in the evening, wherever you were in the world, to check out the story and then file, and you had a single newspaper. Now, my colleagues are all having to file by 10 o'clock in the morning, update by 12, produce something else by 4 o'clock in the afternoon. A much more manic, and how can they do what I did when I was a journalist, which was take the time to ring 3, 4, 5 different people, check the different sources, and do what I always enjoyed most about journalism, which was build a jigsaw puzzle of the story. Each time you got an extra piece of the story, you could add more. Now, you've just got to file the story. One source story you have to file. But working in Brussels was a bit like making a jigsaw puzzle. You had, when I started in Brussels, there were only 9 members of the European community. Then there were 10 with Greece. Then there were Spain and Portugal, and so on. So it gradually grew more and more. The great thing about it was that you could play people off against each other. You could talk to the Irish, and they'd give you a bit of the story, and you talk to the Dutch, they'd give you a bit of the story, and you talk to the Commission. And finally, when you'd actually got quite a bit of the story, then you would go and confront the big players, the French, the Germans, and the Brits, who usually used to lie until you confronted them with a story. And you built it up like a jigsaw puzzle. But it wasn't complete until you had time to do that. And now the pressure to file fast is so much greater. How are we doing on time? I must draw this to a close. So I want to finish my thoughts about so there's the downside of journalism and the downside of all the insecurity. I just want to turn to memory and history thought, because it's been so much of your subject this week. Memory and the use and abuse of history. National stories are highly selective, just like the history book I was talking about that we used to study here. And the history we taught in school is very much that, highly selective. I happen to have an Irish wife, which is very good for me. I am pure English, or as pure as the English might ever be. The Irish were taught in school that there were 2 great monsters of Irish history. One was called Oliver Cromwell, and the other was called Martin Luther. Martin Luther had launched the Protestant Reformation and undermined the Catholic Church, and as for Oliver Cromwell, he had massacred the Irish in the name of parliamentary democracy. But in British schools, those 2 figures were great heroes. Martin Luther had exposed the corruption of the Roman Catholic Church. And as for Oliver Cromwell, he overthrew a rotten monarchy and executed the king. He was a hero. He created the power of Parliament and laid the fundaments of the democratic system we had today. So, how different can it look from opposite sides of a rather small Irish sea? My wife also has a statement that she occasionally makes to me. She denies she made it, but it actually is a very telling statement, and I like to tell it to others from other large countries. The English never remember, and the Irish never forget. Big countries don't remember their crimes, but the small countries do remember them. I think it's something that possibly binds the UK and its empire and Russia together. We're 2 countries which have had great empires. We're like the bookends of Europe, because we have a remarkable amount in common. Now, the empires were very different. The Russian Empire was a land empire. The British Empire was a naval empire. The British Empire was driven by traders, the desire to make money. I think the Russian Empire was more driven by a security question, actually, widening the borders to defend the heartland of Russia. But there's something else that we have in common, quite apart from the fact that we're 2 countries who have still got to come to terms with the fact that we no longer have empires. We both see ourselves as victors of the Second World War, who subsequently suffered in peacetime. Worse, we've actually seen the countries we defeated in the Second World War, Germany, Japan, flourish, become more prosperous, doing better than we've done. And so what we say in Britain is, we won the war and we lost the peace. I think that conviction was a driving force behind the Brexit vote in Britain. Like Russia, we see ourselves simultaneously as victor, rather a long time ago, and victim, that we've got poorer when others who we thought we'd defeated have got much richer. And I think that neither of us is coming to terms well with that psychology of empire or loss of empire. And so when we voted for Brexit in Britain, we used to see the European Union as a filthy Bonapartist plot. Essentially, it was all about the French. And then German unification happened, and suddenly the Brits decided, oh my God, it's the Germans who are running Europe. We don't want to be part of that anymore. And so we get this vote that's trying to turn the clock back to a world when we could turn our back on this uncomfortable Europe and become global Britain once again. The irony is that in misreading our history, and I'm convinced it is misreading our history, that the UK is driving itself into the arms of a Trumpian America, and Russia is driving itself into the arms of a nationalist China. Both rather uncomfortable partners for the future. And one of the lessons of my time in journalism that I just want to repeat, and I will wind up, but is that conspiracy theories seldom hold true. Far more often in reality, governments get things wrong, make mistakes, get confused, don't deliver what they intended. It's cock-up rather than conspiracy, which usually dictates government policy. Far too often we see our governments as all-powerful when actually they're struggling to keep their heads above water. One of the reasons we've had such a mess over Brexit was that ever since the referendum result, which the British government didn't want, it's been struggling to find out what it did want. And I fear that we're going to carry on negotiating for weeks and months and years now because we still don't know quite what a relationship is we want. Cock-up, not conspiracy. As journalists, we should constantly be questioning not the evil intentions of our government, but their competence. Now, the danger, of course, that in doing so, we'll actually contribute to the crisis of trust in our societies, the crisis of trust in our democracy. If our governments are incompetent, what's the point in electing them? So I think one of the lessons I would like to draw from that is we must also not just criticise, knock down, destroy, but give credit where it's due. When John spoke this morning, he set out a very clear and sensible framework of journalistic ethics in his excellent presentation. But I wonder if we can go a little bit further and go beyond the essential ethics of truth and objectivity and a search for accuracy and commit ourselves a little bit more to one or two, in a way, it's how we stay sane in a crazy world, one or two ways of conducting our journalism that I think will make our societies more comfortable in themselves, will rebuild the trust that we seem to have lost. One, I think, is that it should be an absolute rule of our journalism that we try to explain the other, the outsider, the stranger, the foreigner. It's perhaps easy for me to say because all my life I've been a foreign correspondent trying to explain one country to another. All my life I've been trying to explain Europe to the British and the British to Europe. And clearly Brexit means I failed. But nonetheless, we must try. We must try to explain minority communities to the majority, migrant communities to those who find them destabilizing when they arrive in their societies. The outsiders need to be explained. I think that should be part of our journalism. Understand the other. Don't demonize the other. Really depressing thought in the journalism we see in this country is the amount of journalism that is demonizing the immigrant and building building up a negative view of migration, when in fact I think they could do far more to help promote better communal relations. I think the second thing we must do is we must learn to moderate our language, that actually language really matters, and the use of hysterical language and angry accusations, which one sees far too much on the internet, is something that we should really make a commitment to avoid. John mentioned earlier in the week when talking about Brexit, language like scum and racist. I mean, that is utterly unacceptable. Even online, it shouldn't be there. I've been called a traitor. No, excuse my English, I've been called a fucking traitor at demonstrations online. This is language that actually encourages violence and a violent response. And the whole referendum campaign with this black and white debate, this very divisive debate, encouraged that sort of language. How do we do that? I think it's partly self-regulation. We've got to say this doesn't happen. It also must be, talking about it earlier with Roderick's session, how do we get the great engines of social media to actually make sure that hysterical, racist, angry and violent accusations are not carried and left on the web? The third thing I do, and it's slightly more tendentious, I think, is to get the media to try to do more to encourage grassroots engagement and local democracy. I think the crisis that we have, if you like, is more at national democratic level. If people can see that local democracy works on environmental issues, of course, but also in engagement in communal action, in engagement with communal projects, support for refugee schemes or whatever, getting local democracy, and the climate change is the perfect issue to get people engaged in local action. What do we do about fake news? Roderick challenged us all to think, what do we do about fake news? Again, I think that somehow we, as journalists, need to set up a system where people can check news, can actually say, you know, here's something that's out there on the internet. Is it true? Is it false? I think there's another thing, which is a wonderful project that some friends of mine engaged in Belgium and in Germany. They're putting together, ex-journalists have put together a series of presentations for school children about fake news on the internet. Not just for secondary school children, but for primary school children, because after all, it's children of 8, 9, 10 who are already out there on the internet reading stuff, teaching them how to question the news on the internet, teaching them how to do that. If we're going to have more regulation, I think regulation on the internet will come. It will have to come. It's a little bit like the introduction of the motor car. Clearly, there wasn't instantly the regulation that stopped us all crashing into each other, but it came pretty damn quickly. And if the internet proves to be as destabilizing as it threatens to be, there will have to be some form of regulation, but the only way is international regulation. And we're back to a world where retreating internationalism simply won't provide a wide enough agreement to actually say, look, we need to have a system that prevents racism, prevents incitement to violence being distributed, and corruption and fraud. That needs to be regulated, but at international level. Above all, I think we need to believe in what we're doing. I think what worries me most about the drift into this crazy world of the last few years has been the feeling that people are losing faith in liberal democracy, are losing faith in the multilateral system. We've got to have faith. We've got to prove W.B. Yeats wrong when he said the best lack all conviction and the worst are filled with passionate intensity. We've got to have a passionate conviction in the sort of objectivity, the search for truth, the search for good, accurate and undistorted information that actually will underpin a saner world. And I hope that we can prove W.B. Yeats wrong, and I'll stop there.